makes the decision as soon as possible. That would help, wouldn't it?
It certainly would. Our view is that the sooner we could have clarity on data adequacy and indeed on financial services equivalence, the other parallel technical process, the better. But these things take the time that they take, and we are entirely in the EU's hands on that. Good,
that's very helpful. If I could turn to you, Mr. Gove, what's the government's estimate of the total number of additional customs declarations that UK businesses are going to have to make from the 1st of January next year?
Well, at the moment, we're conducting work with the sector in order to determine exactly how many additional customs declarations may be required, and indeed what additional staff may be required in order to process them. So we're in discussion with business at the moment in order to determine exactly what we think the correct projection should be.
You'll be aware that the National Audit Office think it's about 200 million. Are you doing your own work because you don't think that's correct?
Well, we just want it to be as robust as possible. And of course, a lot depends on the way in which people may or may not repackage consignments.
Right. And you didn't think of doing this before you announced earlier this year that everybody would have to fill in customs declarations, whether there was a deal or there wasn't a deal. You're only doing it now, is that right?
Well, it is the case that by definition, people will be filling out customs declarations because we will have left the customs union. Whatever eventual deal we conclude with the EU will be outside their CU.
Right. Now, when you last appeared before us, I asked you how many of the estimated 50,000 additional customs agents needed for the 1st of January had been recruited so far. You said you go away and check, and you wrote to me last night and said it's not possible to put a number on it. Now, is that because you don't know how many customs declarations they're going to be?
No, it's because we're, as I mentioned earlier, working with business in order to ensure that they have the processes and the people in place necessary. And I think it's in the public domain that we conducted a survey earlier this year that 71% of intermediaries said that they were confident that they would be able to meet at least most of the increase in demand for their services in producing additional customs declarations. And 84% of them said that they were confident they would be prepared for full reciprocal controls. It's also the case that the government has spent some £34 billion in order to ensure that capacity can be increased. And we are putting in place a series of metrics which will be monitored by HMRC and the Treasury and indeed the Cabinet Office in order to ensure that the additional capacity required is necessary. The 50,000 figure is, as it were, a sighting shot. What we want to do is to make sure that business is confident that it has the people that it needs.
But you're still confident, as you said to Justin Madison, House of Commons on the 27th of February, that it's going to be possible to train all the people who need to be trained in time for the
Yes. Yes. In response to Justin's question and subsequent questions, as this session gives me the opportunity to clarify, the government stands behind the need to ensure that we increase capacity. 50,000 is, as I say, a sighting short, an estimate. There are different ways in which business will necessarily adjust, but it's the case that of the 31 million pounds of that has been allocated in grants to support training. And it is the case that we have seen more than 20,000 training courses being undertaken.
Well, given the optimism that you just why do you think that the general says that the country is falling many thousands short of the 50,000 target, while the chief executive of the Road Haulage Association says it is impossible to think that we can train this number of people, get them ready and processes in place to be ready on the 1st of January. And the chief executive of the Cold Chain Federation says that we are, quote, hopelessly ill-prepared, close quote. Now, these are all organizations that move stuff for a living, and they don't seem to share your optimism at all. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think it's naturally the case that any organization preparing for the change that will occur on the 31st of December would want to do everything possible. And I know from my experience in government that organizations that would like to see a greater degree of attention to their needs necessarily amplify their requests in a way to make government listen and also to make sure that select committee chairs can put their points with effect. So I think it's part of the general to and fro in which organisations seek to articulate with a particular degree of force the request that government should respond to their demands.
So would it be fair to say you don't take their warnings and expressions of concern terribly serious?
No, I take them very seriously. But I think that, as you probably know by now, while I think it's vitally important to act quickly, I think it's also important to make sure that we're calm, focused and temperate when it comes to delivery.
Well, we'll find out at the end of the year. A final question from me. You published the first paper from the government on what's going to happen for goods that are moving from GB to Northern Ireland.
Yes.
Now, given that we are, 7 months away and businesses really have no idea exactly how it's going to work in practice, whereas the other crossings we've been talking about have had an idea since February, when are they going to know what it is they actually have to do?
Well, it is the case that the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland has been leading engagement with Northern Ireland's businesses and also with, in particular, its farmers and its agri-food sector in order to explain the processes that we are putting in place. And as the command paper on the protocol made clear, there'll be unfettered access for goods from Northern Ireland into Great Britain. There will be some new checks, of course, on products of animal origin, but it's already the case that the committee knows that there are existing checks on live animals.
Interrupt, Mr. Gove. I've read the paper and I know that's what it says. My question was, when will businesses that are sending goods and indeed animals, animal products, livestock from GB to Northern Ireland know what exactly it is they're meant to be doing?
Well, it's relatively clear, I think, for products of animal origin, because there's sorts of checks which are in place, which the EU applies, are well understood. And it's also the case that the process by which, if necessary, customs declarations are made when goods move from Great Britain to Northern Ireland is something that HMRC, and I mentioned the Northern Ireland office, are working with Northern Ireland's businesses. The reaction, I wouldn't want to put words into anyone's mouth, but the reaction from Northern Ireland's businesses, some of whom welcomed the protocol, some of whom were less enthusiastic about it, but the general reaction was welcome for the publication of the command paper. As you quite rightly point out, a desire for greater detail, but we're now working both with the Commission and also with business to ensure that that greater detail is provided.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you very much. Peter Bone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And my questions are directed to Mr. Frost. Could you tell the committee what your role is in government? I understand that you are a special advisor, but how does that work within government?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Bone. Very happy to. Yes, I'm a special advisor appointed by the Prime Minister in the same way as every other special advisor. He's additionally asked me to take on this particular role of being chief negotiator for the future relationship, and I report to him on that. And as you know, CDL is responsible for the other side of this sphere of activity, the withdrawal agreement and readiness at the end of the transition period. So that's my responsibility. The policy, to be clear, the policy within which I work, obviously I advise on that, but the policy is set by the Prime Minister and by the relevant Cabinet Committee, and I work within the framework that they've set for these negotiations.
Well, that's very clear, except in the past, we've always had a minister, a DEXU minister, and a civil servant, and the DEXU minister did the accountability, and if you like, the civil servant got on with implementing the policy. But you seem to be single-handedly doing this. So if there's a political decision to be made, who do you ask?
Well, as I say, the decisions are taken by the Cabinet Committee and by the Prime Minister. So I work within that framework. It's the same answer, and I'm not sure it's very easy to distinguish between a sort of political decision and a negotiating decision in this context. They're all parts of the same operation.
So from what you're saying is that you basically report directly to the Prime Minister. And is that correct?
I report to the Prime Minister on the conduct of the negotiations. Yes, he's asked me to undertake this task, and I also report to the Cabinet Committee that he chairs, the Access Committee that discusses and agrees the main elements of policy.
How often do you have those meetings?
It varies, obviously, according to events. But in principle, we aim to have them every 2 weeks or so. Obviously, the recent crisis has disrupted the rhythm, but we can have them and have had them, when we need to, if the state of the negotiations requires it.
Yes, because you raise a point there, of course. What happened when the Prime Minister was incapacitated? Who were you reporting to then?
Well, obviously, the Prime Minister delegated certain tasks to the first Secretary of State while he was incapacitated. And with that proviso, the machinery continued as before. I think it's fair to say, although there were some things happening in the negotiations at that time, there wasn't a huge amount going on that I needed to trouble very senior ministers with at that point.
Well, that's interesting because there's media reports at that very moment. The Cabinet Secretary was trying to extend the transition period, and it was only the intervention of Dominic Cummings that stopped that. And what's your relationship with Dominic Cummings? You have to report to him because he seemed to say this weekend that he was the gatekeeper to the Prime Minister, and he decided who spoke to the Prime Minister about what. I mean, are you more senior to him, or do you have to go through him?
Well, as I say, I'm not sure I can say more than I've said already, in the sense that I report to the Prime Minister on the conduct of these negotiations and to the committee. I mean, I can say I've never had an instruction on these negotiations from Mr. Cummings, and I don't think he would expect to give me one. He regards me as responsible for these negotiations because the Prime Minister has given me that task.
So you speak to the Prime Minister once every 2 weeks or so. How often do you speak to Dominic Cummings?
Well, I speak to the Prime Minister probably more often than once every 2 weeks, I would say, to keep him up to date with what's going on. I would speak to Mr. Cummings relatively frequently, though the proviso that kind of normal business is being undertaken in an unusual way at the moment because of the needs of social distancing.
Yes, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm running out of time. Could I just put the final point? I mean, I think you might apologize. I apologize in advance of what seems a silly question, but do you think the whole of the Brexit policy would collapse if Mr. Cummings wasn't there?
Yes or no will suffice.
The Brexit policy is set by the Prime Minister and by the committee, so I'm quite confident that whatever the arrangements for special advisors, it would continue.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Jane Stevenson is next. Jane Stevenson.
Sorry, thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Gove and Mr. Frost. My questions are mainly to Mr. Frost and deal with the mechanics of each round of meetings. I think people will be interested. Could you just describe how you prepare for each round, what actually happens in them, and then what happens after the round finishes?
Sure, happy to. So obviously we have tried in these virtual meetings to kind of mimic the structure of a real life round as far as we can. What normally happens is that there is an opening plenary session where each lead negotiator, and there are a dozen or so on each side, sets out where they think the negotiations have reached. We then spend 2 or 3 days in detailed discussions, and as you'll have seen from the agenda we published, there's 11 or 12 different work streams working roughly in parallel. That goes on for 2 or 3 days, and then we have a plenary session to wrap up at the end of each round. So that's the formal mechanics. Obviously, we have, as you would expect, a kind of internal process before that to establish how we wish to take forward each work stream, what issues are going to be discussed, what ground we wish to cover, and then within the round, at the end of each day, we have a reporting system, both on paper and orally, that captures what's going on. I myself don't lead any of the individual work streams. I simply dip in to those work streams as seems best.
Thank you. Can you, who attends each of the different work streams? Does that vary? Are they civil servants, people from your team? And do you ever invite any other people to attend those?
Yeah, so each work stream, there's a lead negotiator for that, most of which are in my team. There are a few who are not from elsewhere in Whitehall departments, and they're supported by a mix of people from my team and from the relevant Whitehall departments. So in any, if you're thinking of a physical meeting, in those meetings there could be anything from, for example, 5 people on our side to as many as 15 to 20, depending on what the ground being covered was and the sort of level of detail.
Thank you. I want to move on to the latitude that you're given in each of these work streams and in the negotiations. How much latitude are you given, and at what point do you have to consult back to government? And if that happens, how do you achieve that, and on what timescale?
Yeah, so we're still at a sort of relatively early stage of the negotiation. I mean, it's extremely accelerated compared to a normal one, but you know, we are still nevertheless at the stage of setting out positions, explaining each other's positions, identifying areas of kind of convergence and divergence, I suppose. We have a very clear mandate that was set out in the document we published on the 27th of February, the UK approach document. And sort of for now, that is all we need. You know, we're at the stage of setting out our position and explaining it and trying to land it and persuading the EU of its merits. So, you know, I hope soon we will. I mean, we would like to be in it already, but we don't seem to be quite there yet. I would like soon to be in discussions where we're genuinely kind of seeing if we can move forward. And at that point, obviously, I would need to consult back on anything significant, but we're not quite at that stage yet, probably, of this process.
Thank you. And I'd like to ask about you and the EU chief negotiator. Do you dip in and out of these streams, or will you when it becomes slightly more detailed? And do you have the chance to meet Mr. Barnier one-to-one? And do you have those informal conversations that possibly you'd have if negotiations weren't being online?
Yeah, we try to. I mean, not during each round. Obviously, he and I will talk to each other from time to time. We have small meetings to just sort of take stock and, if you like, compare notes of what we see as happening. And usually, not always, we'll have a sort of a meeting before and after each round to sort of check that we have the same understanding of where we got to. So that is on video. That's basically all you can do. Obviously, it isn't as good as going for a coffee with somebody, but I think it accomplishes the purpose for the stage of the negotiations we're in.
Okay, thank you very much. We are going to have to move on. I'm terribly sorry. Next, it's Mark Eastwood. Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Mr. Gove and Mr. Frost. I've just got a question to Mr. Frost, if I could. Mr. Frost, how has COVID-19 affected the talks?
Well, principally by causing a pause. Obviously, when the crisis first hit us in a major way during March, we lost the second round that had been planned for the middle of March, and as illness hit various members of the team, there was a pause for a time. We then picked it up, so we've had rounds since then, and obviously done by video. I think the main difficulty we've had is the one that we've commented on a little bit before, which is just the difficulty of mimicking by video what happens in a real meeting. You could do it to some extent, but there are some things you can't necessarily sort of read or discuss in a way that you would normally. But so far, I would say, it's paused slightly. We're perhaps a little bit behind where we would like to have been otherwise, but only by a week or two.
Right. Okay. Thank you. So, in terms of the number of people in your team, has it affected those that can attend and make contributions in a big way?
No, I would say not. I mean, actually, we've been impressed by what we can do by video conferencing, and in the plenary meetings, for example, we've had 100 plus people on the video conferencing system, so 50 from either side, and that accommodates anybody who wants to. So no, we've been able to make it work in the same way that everybody is making things work at the moment. Okay.
And has COVID-19 led to any changes in areas of priority for the negotiations, and if so, where?
No, I wouldn't say it had. I think we set out our approach in the document on the 27th of February, the UK approach document, and that is still valid. I would say. We both know what ground needs to be covered. We're both pretty ambitious for it, but I don't think it's changed anything.
Right. Okay. So, to a wider point, in light of COVID-19, some people have called for an extension to the transition period, whereas others have said that there would be detrimental economic consequences of extending. What's your view?
Well, as I say, I don't make policy, I only advise on it. The policy is set by the Prime Minister and by XS, and it's the firm policy of the government that we will not extend the transition period, and if asked, we would not agree to it. And I take that as a given. I can see why that position has been taken. I think we've always put a lot of emphasis on economic and political freedom at the end of this year, and on avoiding ongoing significant payments into the EU budget. And of course, those things are accomplished by ending the transition period at the end of the year. So I work within that, and it's my job to get an agreement in the time that's available.
Okay. In terms of the timescales, do you expect to be able to conduct face-to-face negotiations in the time that remains? And if so, when?
I mean, we're in the hands of others, obviously, on how easy it is to travel, where obviously the picture changes, and we wait to see how that evolves. I'd very much like to be able to do face-to-face discussions. If it turns out we can't, obviously we'll work within that. But I've no doubt it will be somewhat more dynamic if we could.
Okay, fine. I'd like to move on from COVID-19, if time allows. You recently wrote to Mr. Barnier, and he wrote back. What was your objective in writing to him, and what did you learn from his response?
Well, as I said, I think we thought it was just the right moment to set out what we were trying to achieve, what the state of play in the negotiations was, and I guess also to kind of make clear to wider observers how we saw things. Obviously, Michel Barnier knows the state of play of the negotiations. He doesn't, we talk about that all the time. But we have, if you like, a sort of structural difficulty that other member states and other actors in Brussels hear about what's going on in the negotiations via the Commission and those who are in it, whereas when they are talking to us, they're talking directly to the UK government. So although we've made a point, as I said in the letter, of not seeking to divide and rule, as some people say, or going directly to member states, we don't think that would help. We nevertheless, from time to time, want everyone who has an interest in these negotiations to know properly how we see them and where they stand. And that was the point of this letter. I think the letter back from Michel was courteous and forceful, just as mine was, and set out some familiar views about what's important to the EU, and there we are.
Okay. Well, you say courteous and forceful.
Sorry, Mark, we've run out of time and we're going to get everyone else.
Okay, thank you very much.
Rupa Huck is next.
Hi there, thanks. Mine are also for David Frost. First of all, given that any extension to transition has been repeatedly ruled out, I mean, really, these questions are going to be about how well-resourced government is to deal with the twin contingencies of coronavirus, which was completely unforeseen, and the possibility of what might be a no trade deal in terms of civil service capability. So first of all, really following up from Peter Bone's question, are we kind of now in an era where we've seen the rise of the special advisor, possibly even the supremacy of the special advisor? You are an appointment at Boris Johnson's pleasure, whereas your predecessor, Ollie Robbins, was on a civil service contract. We saw the whole Dominic Cummings Rose Garden press conference this weekend. And just specifically wanted to ask, what did you make of the odd incident at the weekend when the official UK civil service account tweeted the words arrogant and offensive truth twisters in relation to the government? Did it symbolise a wider malaise of these traditional Mandarin type people who feel they're being sidelined? We also saw Sir Philip Rutnam's unusual public comments earlier. Just wondered about the relationship between the two.
I think that's really a question for me, Rupert, because it's obviously a question about the political direction that is given to those who work.
I did think that because he's sort of head of a team of civil servants, it'd be interesting to hear Sir David, and also we have you often at this committee, and less so David Frost, so I'd like to hear his as well. If we can have him first, and then if there's time at the end, because we're on a very strict time limit, and I've got a few.
Quite, but it's also the case that the questions you ask are not David's responsibility. David is not in charge of the Cabinet Office or UK Civil Service Twitter feed. He's not responsible for the appointment of special advisors. He's not responsible for setting government policy. All of those are decisions for ministers.
Yes, so David, just wondered what you thought of this relationship between the traditional and the new.
Again, it is, you know, it's a very interesting question, but it's not a matter for David. If we talk about traditional and new, we could look back at different parallels with different people who've been appointed as political advisors at different times in the past. To what extent was the role of Bernard Donahue in?
They don't usually become household names. They don't usually become household names in the way this generation have, or give Rose Garden press conference. I think that's quite unusual.
I think political historians would certainly say that someone like Lady Marcia Falkender was a household name, or that.
I don't remember her doing a press conference in that way with the world's media, keeping everyone waiting half an hour as well.
I don't know much about Lady Marcia Falkender's timekeeping, but it was certainly the case that she was a figure of some controversy at the time.
Well, look, okay, I'll go on to the more civil service ones if Sir David is not able to answer that one. We heard the other week from Mr. Gove that there are 47 British civil servants who were redeployed from all over Whitehall, from future relationship talks to COVID planning. And I asked you, Mr. Gove, what staff absences there have been. I didn't get an answer to that. I just wondered if David Frost knew staff members of the civil service falling ill, shielding, looking after others. Do we know those?
I think
that's fair.
I think the 47, as I remember, was from both our teams, so from mine and from the wider transition awareness preparation team. Indeed, I think it must have been, because I've only got 40 or so in my team. A small number of people from my team were detached to work on COVID during the crisis. Mostly they have come back, and we are able to proceed as we could before with a largely full complement. I would just add, though, that the negotiating effort is much wider than those 40 to 45 people in my team. It's many more people across Whitehall who are engaged in helping and supporting.
And do we know, because that was at an earlier stage that I asked you, Mr. Gove, how many of those people that at an earlier stage went into COVID planning have now moved back to the Transition Task Force, to Task Force Europe and to other units that are planning our future relationship with the EU?
A number have come back.
A number? Do we have any specificity?
We're in the process of rejigging the committee structure within the government overall, and there are some people who are in the process of being redeployed at the moment. There are bodies in.
Well, it would be. We need to move on. It'd be very helpful if you could write to the committee, Mr.
Of course.
That information, if that would be helpful.
What is it settled?
And David Frost, I know that you have 40.
Rupa,
yeah.
I'm sorry, we've run out of time.
No way. Oh, goodness me.
We have. It's now Anthony Higginbottom. Anthony.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good afternoon, Mr. Gove and Mr. Frost. Very good to have you. I want to talk about the draft legal text to start with, if I can. This is probably one more for you, Mr. Frost. We've spoken about precedent quite a lot. The government negotiating objectives make clear that we're basing the negotiations on precedent. So I wondered what the starting point was when the UK's draft legal text was created. Was it a blank sheet of paper that the team started with, or was it an existing agreement that we then tweaked to meet what the UK was trying to seek?
So no, it was not a blank sheet of paper. It was based on free trade agreements that the EU has already agreed or is in the process of negotiating with other third countries. So we have drawn extensively from those. I think principally, I would say our text is drawn from the Canada Free Trade Agreement. There is language in it drawn from the Japan agreement, and in other cases we've drawn on from the kind of offer that the EU has made to Australia and New Zealand. So we haven't drawn rigidly from any one source, and the reason for that is that practice in free trade agreements has evolved quite a lot over the last 10 years. The level of ambition, the level of scope has moved on, and each one has by and large become a bit more ambitious than its predecessor, and obviously they're all tailored to particular circumstances. So I don't think it would have been right, if you like, just to take the Canada one, cross out the word Canada and write in UK. We've been quite a lot more sophisticated than that, but we've drawn on recognisable free trade precedents in all cases.
And presumably also trying to make it match UK economic needs, which are obviously different to Canada-EU trade.
Yes, exactly. So, I mean, for example, in most free trade agreement areas like mutual recognition agreements, rules of origin, and so on, are quite specific and tailored to the individual needs, and that's how we've tried to take this forward in this case too.
What about the fisheries draft text? Where was that drawn from?
That text is drawn quite a lot from the EU-Norway fisheries agreement. It's been modernised in a couple of areas. I think, for example, to bring in a forum for consultation on fisheries, which was not in the Norway text, which is I think quite an old one now. But it is very much drawn from it, and recognisably the same kind of agreement, I would say.
I did a little bit of digging on the different types of agreements the EU has with third countries on fisheries. It looks like they've got 22. Norway is clearly the most extensive. I mean, Norway is not the country that has the closest proximity to the EU. You look at somewhere like Morocco, which is 14 kilometres away. So I'm wondering why the EU's where the intransigence comes from. Have you had a sense of where that comes from? Because it's clearly not geographic.
No, I mean, Michel Barnier has to work within the mandate that's given him by member states, and they, in their wisdom, decided that their sort of opening pitch for this should be that as far as possible, the common fisheries policy should continue after we left, just as it does while we were a member. And we find that a bit unusual because in many other areas they tell us, nothing can be the same after you've left the EU. Rightly so, it is different, but fisheries seems to be the one exception to that. I think, to be fair to him, Mr. Barnier has given a few public signals that he thinks this may not be a completely realistic position. And we'll have to see if they can move forward on that. Clearly, it's not a runner for us. I mean, it just is not. So we'll have to find a way forward. Could just make one other point on that. It's worth noting that every other fisheries agreement the EU has is a freestanding agreement. It's not connected to anything else or part of anything else. Uniquely, the EU says that the fisheries agreement for us must be part of a wider agreement with all the dispute settlement and other process that goes with it. And again, that's not borne out by any of the other precedents they have.
Thank you.
That brings me very nicely on to my next question.
Sorry, Anthony, your 5 minutes has just gone. And my apologies. If there's any time at the end, I will try and bring colleagues I've had to cut off back in, but I need to make sure I get everybody in. Next is Mark Fletcher. Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can I just sort of pick up where we left off on that particular question, and to pick up on something the Chairman started with? It seems like there's a level of sort of intransigence, a sort of a non-moving element of the EU's position. Is this the negotiating mandate, or is this the negotiator that's causing the difficulties?
I mean, I think it's the job of the negotiators to try and deliver the mandate. Obviously, that's the task Mr. Barnier has been given, and he's going about it very sort of seriously and professionally. I think, I mean, this is a sort of personal view, really, though I said it before in that lecture I gave back in February, that I think sometimes the EU, is still coming to terms with the fact that there is a large country in Europe that doesn't want to be part of the EU's structure in some way, or to sort of work on EU norms, or to relate to the EU as the sort of centre of its reference point of its activity. And I think some member states and some parts of the EU system have come to terms with that reality more quickly than others, but it is a reality, and if we're going to get an agreement, it'll have to be understood, I think, on the EU side.
So would it be your takeaway that Mr. Barnier is sort of more aware of the modern reality? He's sort of more practical and willing to move, and is just being bound by the current position?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't want to comment on how he personally sees things or his contacts with member states. I simply don't know about that. But I think it's the job of a good negotiator, and he is one, to assess reality and the genuine positions of the other side and the genuine ability to move. And if you don't assess reality in a cold way, then you don't get agreements. And I would expect that he'll be doing that, and in fact, I'm sure he is.
Do you think the involvement of sort of senior politicians, sort of greater cooperation between the various politicians involved, will help to shift things along as well?
On the EU side, I think what is important is that I mean the EU collectively obviously has quite a lot on its plate at the moment, as we all do, but they have their financing negotiation to conduct. They have their plans for economic reform and so on in 2021, and I think it's important that they keep enough focus on these negotiations as well, and don't relegate them to something that can be done when they get round to it, as it were. So I think political attention on the very serious points we raised in my letter, is going to be an important part of coming to an agreement. Yeah.
I wanted to pick up in his press statement on the 24th of April. There was a mention of sort of governance, and he said, as a basis for our cooperation, we need to refer to common values such as democracy, rule of law, and human rights, counter-terrorism, or the fight against climate change as as an essential principle. These don't seem like things that the UK would be against. Is there a sort of an alternative way in which the UK would like to see these involved in this agreement? And could you just outline that to the committee?
Yeah, this is the EU's familiar position with all free trade or similar agreements, that they have a list of essential elements, so-called, for cooperation, and if they don't believe the other side is obeying them, then the agreement can be suspended. So they've just added climate change to the traditional list. So I think there's now 6 rather than 5, and we are the first country with whom they're negotiating the climate is on the list. They are, I think it's fair to say, always quite controversial in these negotiations. Not obviously because of the substance, but not every country thinks it's necessary to write these things into trade agreements when a country regards itself as a very responsible international actor. And for example, with the Canada negotiation, they turned out to be extremely controversial, though I don't think anybody doubts Canada's commitment to internationalism, democracy, and so on. So we'll have to find a way of accommodating these points of principle. As you say, we don't disagree on them. I think it's simply a way of finding the right way of expressing them.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm now going to call Stephen Killick. Stephen.
Thank you very much indeed, Chair, and Mr. Frost and Mr. Gove. I just wanted to pick up on a point that you, Mr. Frost, made in your letter to Michel Barnier, where you opened up the possibility of not being committed to a 100% tariff-free negotiation. Have you done a time estimate of how much time it would take your negotiating team, and indeed the EU's negotiating team, to pivot away from a zero tariff approach to line-by-line negotiations, given that we're 6 months away from ending the transition period?
Well, to be honest, I'm sceptical about drawing any sort of precedent from how long it's taken in the past to do a trade agreement. We're already operating kind of well beyond precedent in every element of this, looking at the timescale. And luckily, we are also operating on the basis of textual precedent that enables us to kind of draw on things that already exist, and so accelerate that timescale. So simply because it's taken for months or years in other negotiations to achieve a tariffs negotiation doesn't mean that it will in this case. There are many things we have to do in this negotiation that normally take time, and we will have to do very fast. And I'm confident we can do that. So I don't regard it as a practical difficulty. Clearly, there is a policy issue involved there that is significant.
It just seems like a pretty big issue to throw in the middle of. Sorry, have I frozen?
No, there's a problem with our screen. I think we just need to press a button in order to make sure that we don't disappear.
Oh, okay, sorry. Sometimes it freezes.
No. And this mustn't cut into your time, Stephen.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, it just seems like I guess a pretty big hand grenade to throw into the negotiations 6 months before they're due to finish, that you are shifting away from this commitment to zero tariffs. What about business? Have you had conversations with business about the impact of shifting away from a zero tariff approach? What feedback have you had from the business community?
Well, I think we all want a zero tariffs agreement, a zero tariff, zero quota agreement. That's what we said in the political declaration that we wanted, and we still hope to get it. And I think every business who's observing this negotiation will prefer to have that, as would we. I think the point we were making, or I was making in my letter, was that it's more as a matter of logic. The EU says that zero tariffs, zero quotas are unprecedented, and therefore need to have unprecedented level playing field provisions. We're saying, okay, go back to precedented then. then you won't need level playing field agreements, perhaps. And so far, the answer from the EU has been, actually, we do. We still need them even then. So I guess it leaves me sceptical that level playing field agreements provisions in the EU's eyes are much to do with access, and they're more about control.
Well, thanks very much. I guess it's also the risk of sounding like you're making empty threats, because I guess the EU knows that given there's only 6 months left and there doesn't seem to have been much consultation with our business community, we wouldn't actually be able to push through on getting a line-by-line negotiation on tariffs. But that's maybe just a conversation for another day. I just wanted to turn to you, Mr. Gove, if I may, relating to Northern Ireland. On the 8th of November, the Prime Minister told a group of Northern Irish businesses that there would categorically be absolutely no checks on trade crossing the Irish Sea. He even told them that if anyone asked for them to fill in such paperwork, they should just throw it in the bin, quote unquote. But last week you confirmed that checks would indeed be required in 2 airports and 2 major ports. Did the Prime Minister knowingly mislead the British people in November 2019?
No.
So what can you explain the massive disparity then between throw all paperwork in the bin on the 8th of November 2019 to yourself saying last week there will be checks and significant paperwork going forward? There's a pretty, you've turned on a sixpence there.
The first thing I would say is that we've always been clear, indeed it was the Prime Minister who outlined in the course of the negotiations leading up to the signing of the withdrawal agreement, that we would extend the understanding that Northern Ireland was a single epidemiological zone to making sure that it was a single SPS zone. So it was always the case that there would be additional processes that those who are exporting products of animal origin or other agri-food goods would have to face. It's also the case that the protocol requires us to ensure that goods at risk of going into the EU's single market are identified, and that's why we have a light touch electronic process which will ensure that those companies that are doing trade from Great Britain into Northern Ireland can be monitored in an appropriate way. But there won't be the need for customs infrastructure or checks of the kind that are commonly understood.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, and you got injury time. Stephen, next it's Nicola Richards. Nicola Richards.
Chair. So my question is to Mr. Frost. So we've seen Mr. Barnier's letter, but how does Michel Barnier respond in the negotiations when you explain to him the UK's difficulty with the EU's position on the level playing field?
Well, I think it's fair to say that we have a fundamental disagreement at the moment on most aspects of the level playing field. There are 1 or 2 areas that are slightly less controversial and problematic, but in most of the important areas there's a big gap, and he obviously is delivering the mandate he was given. Member states regarded level playing field as very important. To recall, we are not saying that there can be no level playing field provisions. We're simply saying that there must be provisions which are appropriate to a free trade agreement, unlike those found in the Canada or Japan agreements, and that is what we have put forward. But there is a big gap between those and where the EU is, and that will be one of the biggest issues we've got to resolve in the next few months.
Thank you. Do you think the fundamental barrier for the UK is that the level playing field involves concepts of EU law, or is it that the UK government doesn't think it should be bound by commitments in these areas?
I mean, the fundamental issue for us is about setting our own laws. That Brexit was about the right of the British people to set their own laws and have those adjudicated in their own courts. So, if you like, that is the point of principle that we bring to this process. As I said, there are some commitments in the Canada and other agreements that we've been willing to make in return for a trade agreement, but they're a long way from from where the EU wants to go. So, you know, this fundamental disagreement is a line of principle, which at the moment seems quite difficult to find a way through.
Thank you. And what's the difference in the UK and the EU's respective positions on state aid?
So on state aid, basically the EU's view is that we should continue to apply their state aid rules at the point at which we leave, and that if there are any changes to them subsequently, we should apply them as well. And that if we don't do so, they would have the right to take measures, i.e. impose tariffs on us. We, in their vision, would not have the same right to impose tariffs on them if they regarded us as, if we regarded them as doing something different. We are looking for something that's much more like the Canada Agreement, which is, you know, sort of fundamentally based on WTO rules, plus a clear requirement to transparency and consultation. So to tell the other side what subsidies you're giving, to give them an opportunity to complain about it, to try and resolve issues through dialogue and discussion, rather than imposing one side's laws on the other.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Next is Seema Malhotra. Seema.
Thank you very much, Chair. I want to thank as well Mr. Frost and Mr. Gove for giving evidence today. I wanted to draw your attention back to the political declaration, which talked about an ambitious, wide-ranging and balanced economic partnership, part of that being ensuring open and fair competition and encompassing robust commitments to a level playing field. It also talked about the scope and depth of the future relationship and the economic connectedness of the parties. Could I ask whether you expect us to have the same, more or less connectedness to the EU economically than we do now?
Gosh, is that a question for David, or would you like us both to reply?
Start with David, please.
Cool. Okay. So I think the honest answer is we don't know. I mean, that decision will be in the hands of private sector actors, you know, as far as you're looking at supply chains, trade patterns, and so on. You know, obviously, we will develop our own legal regimes in various areas as things go forward after the end of this year, and that'll influence the decisions they take. I'd note that we are already, you know, somewhat, as I said in my letter to Mr. Varney, we're already somewhat less integrated than many other countries in the continent of Europe to the EU. So we're already in a slightly different position compared to others.
You must have done some assessment, I would have thought, about whether there'll be a loosening or tightening of economic connectedness. Mr. Gove, has there been any recent assessment, and has there been any review of if there is any change that you might expect from new trade relationships?
Well, I very much agree with David that the degree of economic connectedness, of course, depends sometimes on decisions that governments make, but also on the decisions of hundreds of thousands of private sector actors. Now, it will be the case that even with the ambitious free trade agreement that we hope to secure, that there will be new processes that some businesses will think about as they're looking at how they organize their supply chains. It will also be the case that we hope there'll be new openings with free trade agreements with America, Japan, and others. But there is a third and a very, very big factor, which is both because of COVID-19, but also because of other changes which were happening technologically anywhere. We've seen a phenomenon of reshoring, and we're seeing how countries think about increased resilience. So without wanting to run away from the question, I think that it's impossible to state precisely, but I do think that the shape of the UK economy, like the shape of member state economies in the EU, is going to change.
It does sound like you don't have even a view on that, which does surprise me, because I would have thought by now the government will have been looking at what the impact could be of what it's proposing. You're looking to decide whether or not to go ahead with a deal in June. and I think we would have thought you'd have been a bit further forward on that, and also the potential impact on employment, particularly as the challenges are now also coming with COVID-19. But perhaps I could move on to just another point, which is just following on from the discussions around state aid and fair rules and competition. Enforcing this will need standards and mechanisms for the implementation of the new rules, as well as how there might be enforcement of those rules. Is the enforcement mechanism for state aid in the UK proposals similar or different to that proposed by the EU? And would that be the same enforcement mechanisms for labour, social and environmental conditions?
So they're different. On state aid, what the EU would like is for us to set up a so-called independent authority, I guess a bit like the Commission, which would rule on state aid measures. There would, in their view, be independent enforcement rather like now, which is logical because they want us to operate the EU system. So I can see the logic of that, even though we don't agree with it. On labour, environment, and so on, it varies slightly in the EU view. In some of those areas, they'd also like us to set up an independent body. In labour and social affairs, they simply require us, as we already do, to have domestic measures for enforcement. So in some areas, they're pushing the boundary further than we would want. In all areas, of course, we regard ourselves as compliant with high standards already. So the one with which their level playing field provisions tries to deal, in our view, exist.
Okay. No, thank you very much indeed. We do need to move on. Apologies. Can I now call Sir Christopher Chope? Sir Christopher.
Thank you. Can I thank you both for the principled approach you're taking to the negotiations on fisheries? And can I ask Mr. Frost in what respects he thinks the EU negotiating position is going to be more realistic in the next round of negotiations?
I didn't catch the start of the fisheries, I'm afraid, but...
So I started off my question by thanking you both for the principled approach you're taking to fisheries negotiations. And then I asked in what respects you thought that the EU position was going to be more realistic in the coming negotiation.
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure that it necessarily will be in the short run. We've got a negotiating round next week, and we'll have to see one or two signals that they, as I said, would like to evolve the position on fisheries. We'll have to see if that will supply the EU with a lot of detailed information about how our proposed fisheries agreement would work. We haven't had any back, though it has been promised, and if we can get it back before next week, then perhaps this is an area where it can get a bit more constructive. But at the moment, it seems very difficult beyond these issues of principle, but we will keep trying.
But didn't the political declaration say that all this had to be resolved by July? So are you saying it's not going to be resolved by July?
On fisheries, it sets as an aspiration that we should try and reach a fisheries agreement by July, because obviously negotiations for 2021 need to begin soon, and I guess ideally you'd want to know what the framework for those negotiations was. It's not an absolute requirement, and I'm beginning to think we might not make it by the 30th of June, so we'll keep trying.
So are you arguing now for severance of negotiations about fisheries from the rest of the negotiation, which, as you pointed out earlier, is something that has happened in the past?
Yeah, I mean, we always regard fisheries as an area in its own. I mean, in every other country does freestanding fisheries agreements that are not part of wider agreements of any kind. And we don't regard fisheries as something that can be traded for any other bit of a negotiation. There is something very important happening at the end of the year, which is that we get back control of our own waters and the right to determine who fishes in them, and any agreement has simply got to accommodate that reality.
So on the 1st of January, if there isn't an agreement by then we will just take back control of our waters and the EU will have to beg, borrow or steal.
Well, they will have to. I mean, we will definitely get control of our waters. If it looks like we're not going to get a fisheries agreement of any kind, then there'll have to be negotiation inside the fisheries agreement, but we will set the terms because we control access.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much indeed. Next, Sally Ann Hart. Sally Ann.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you to Messrs Gove and Frost for coming to talk to us this afternoon. I just wanted to have a follow-up question on the fisheries point. So Michael Barnier has said he will not accept cherry picking from our past agreements, and the EU is looking to the future, not to the past in these negotiations. So I wondered whether you could tell me, why do you think the EU looks to the past on fisheries to around 1970 as part of a future agreement? Mr. Frost, yes.
I think obviously the European Union member states, some of them have significant fisheries industries, and don't want to lose the very generous access they've got to our waters. So in one sense, I understand that. They hope to keep some of it, but unfortunately, that's not the reality of what leaving the European Union means, and they have to get to that reality. And we can have a genuine negotiation, but we can't have a negotiation that's about continuing, so that only applies to EU members.
Thank you. Mr. Gove, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think your exactly exemplifies the issue.
So thank you. So the EU really can't cherry pick either, can it? So let's go over to governance. On governance arrangements, the EU proposes a structure that's not replicated in other EU agreements with third countries, except those that aspire to join the EU. So perhaps you can tell me, Mr. Frost first, and Mr. Gove might want to come on in this. Is the EU ignoring their own third country status rules in respect of the UK?
I think you could make a case. That's what is happening. I think probably what is happening is that they are looking at the models of agreements with other countries in the continent of Europe, if you like, and sort of drawing from those. And obviously those tend to be with countries who either want a close relationship without being members, or hope one day to be members and are willing to take commitments that we're not. So their proposal for governance and dispute settlement is one single agreement with a very tough dispute settlement mechanism within it, which would require any issue of EU law to go to the European Court. I mean, obviously we can't accept that because it's not an equal process. What we've proposed, as you know, is a suite of agreements, many of which are well precedented elsewhere: civil, nuclear, air transport, air safety. All of these have their own well understood dispute settlement mechanisms and governance in many other similar agreements around the world, and we are simply drawing on those, which we know work well in other contexts. So although the EU represents their system as simpler because it's one agreement, actually we think ours is simpler because we're just drawing on models that already exist.
Thank you. Do you expect the EU position to be more pragmatic on governance in the next negotiating round?
I don't particularly expect it, no. I think it is an area where it is possible to have a genuine discussion. I don't think we've got there yet, but wherever we go has got to reflect fundamentals that we're not having the European Court involved in arbitration of disputes involving this country.
So it might be resolved, but it might not be.
I mean, if we're to find an agreement overall, obviously we'll have to find a way through this. At the moment, there's a long way between us.
So would it be in the UK's interest to have an overarching governance framework so that it could apply pressure on the EU, or even withdraw access in one area if the EU is causing difficulties in an unrelated one? Or would it not be in our interest to have an overarching governance framework?
I mean, I think that is the risk of an overarching framework, that a dispute in one area allows retaliation in an area that's completely unrelated to it and sort of totally irrelevant to it. I like to think that wouldn't be our practice anyway as a country, because we like sort of good order in these international agreements and would behave accordingly. I don't think it's in our interest to allow cross retaliation in totally unconnected sectors. No.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you very much. Next is Joanna Cherry. Joanna.
Mr. Gove, last week, last Thursday at the Joint Ministerial Committee, my Scottish Government colleague, Mike Russell, tells me that you agreed to his suggestion, which was supported by the other devolved administrations, that proper consultation should involve a ministerial quadrilateral with all three devolved administrations before the next round of negotiations. Can you confirm that you will abide by that agreement?
I said to Mike, who put forward a very constructive suggestion, that I would go away and talk to other government colleagues. It is my aim, certainly, to ensure that we can have a ministerial quadrilateral beforehand, yes.
That'll be before next Monday, before the 1st of June.
We want to have it at an appropriate point.
Now, Mr. Frost, looking to your recent correspondence with Mr. Barnier, and in particular the heading of law enforcement and judicial cooperation in criminal matters, you referred to the EU seeking what you said were exceptional and intrusive safeguards in this area. What did you mean by that, and why are these so unacceptable to the United Kingdom?
Well, we've touched on data adequacy already at the start, so let me mention a couple of others. I think one area that presents us problems is their view of our obligations under the ECHR. As CDL said in, I think, previous hearings, obviously we are members of the ECHR and members in good order and committed to that. But what the EU is suggesting is that our internal implementation of those commitments should also be subject to their jurisdiction, and that we should not be able to change it in any way.
I wonder if I could interrupt you there, as time is so short, because that's what I really want to ask you about, is the ECHR. Now, the EU's negotiation text guillotine clause indicates that if the UK were to denounce the ECHR or to abrogate domestic law giving effect to the ECHR, then the cooperation in law enforcement and judicial cooperation in criminal matters would be terminated. And as you say, Mr. Gove gave us an assurance last time that the United Kingdom has no plans to leave the ECHR. But of course, what makes the ECHR accessible to British citizens is the Human Rights Act. That's what allows individuals in the UK to invoke the rights contained in the ECHR in our domestic courts. And the Conservative manifesto last year promised to update the Human Rights Act So what I'm keen to find out today is this. Is the reason why you are so reluctant to agree to the guillotine clause, the safeguards in Article 36, is that because the Conservative government's plan to update the Human Rights Act may remove from British citizens the ability to realise their rights under the ECHR in Britain's domestic courts? And of course, that would trigger the guillotine clause, because that would mean that we would have abrogated the ability to enforce. So can I just get some clarification from you? Are your political instructions not to agree to that because of the government's plans to water down the direct effect of the ECHR under the Human Rights Act?
No.
Well, what is the reason then? If you're planning to keep the Human Rights Act as it is, and if you've no intention of leaving the ECHR, having agreed in the political declaration to these matters, why are you so reluctant to agree to Article 136? What is it? What is it? If it's not your plans to update the Human Rights Act, what is it that makes you so reluctant to agree to adherence to domestic effect of the ECHR?
It's a question of sovereignty, and the EU determining whether or not our own legislation is sufficient to give effect to the rights of citizens to ensure that their position under the ECHR is safeguarded.
You see, it's not really a question of sovereignty, is it? It's just a question of preserving the status quo. And the status quo is that we're signed up to the convention and we've got a Human Rights Act which gives it direct effect. Why, if you're not planning on changing that, are you so worried about signing up to this clause?
It is a question of sovereignty. To say that one particular legislative mechanism is pristine, perfect, and cannot be changed unless you secure the permission of another sovereign entity, I think is an infringement of sovereignty. Now, some people might argue that it was justified, but it's nevertheless an infringement.
So you want to leave open the possibility of interfering with the Human Rights Act. That's the case, isn't it?
Well, we might enhance it in all sorts of ways.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Next is Dr. Philippa Whitford.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chair. Coming to yourself, Mr. Gove, on the 19th of May, you said that the UK wants access to all the crime-fighting, law enforcement and criminal justice tools of the EU, but cannot accept the jurisdiction of the ECJ as a precondition for so doing. The security of data flows is central to many sectors, including finance and financial services, healthcare. So is it not that the UK wants all the benefits, but isn't willing to accept the obligations and citizen protections?
No, as David, I think, pointed out earlier, we believe that, so it's a matter for the EU to decide, that data adequacy is something that we meet and should enjoy. And on that basis, the data flows to which you just referred would be uninterrupted.
But was the UK not criticised in 2018 for sharing data from the SIS system with US companies? And people's own data is a critical issue. Obviously, a lot of discussion at the moment regarding the COVID app.
Yes, there is. And I can't remember all of the not litigation, but the toing and froing, which was required given the position with the United States. But in essence, we apply EU law in this country through GDPR that should ensure adequacy unless and until there is some rupture with that. And that should be adequate for the reasons that we outline. You are right, of course, that there are broad questions about data standards and data protection. But I think it's fair to say that the UK is a world leader in making the case for the highest possible standards of data protection.
I just would point out that obviously you just said until something like GDPR is changed. That's exactly the concern that people have. Coming to yourself, Mr. Frost, some parts of the draft legal text just seem to have placeholders, including on protected geographical indicators, which is very critical for premium food and drink producers, such as here in Scotland. Now there it suggests that Article 54.2 of the legally binding withdrawal agreement may be changed. So can you tell me what is the Commission view of this? And doesn't it just create more security for businesses and particularly for those who are food and drink producers?
Yeah, so the problem with the withdrawal agreement, which obviously we are committed to, is that it requires us to protect EU GIs in this country in perpetuity, but does not place any such obligation on the EU to protect ours. That's just reality of where we are. Now, that particular article of the withdrawal agreement explicitly envisages that it might be replaced by something else in the future. It says it lasts until replaced. I can't remember the precise words. You know, obviously, we would like to have something that is a bit more balanced and makes sure that our GIs are properly protected. So that is really the approach we're seeking to take, and we're hoping to begin discussions with the EU on this quite soon now.
Obviously, one of the first demands of the US trade papers was to get rid of the protected geographical indicator on Scotch, as in Scotch whisky. So is there not going to be a clash between trying to protect UK protected geographical indicators and pressure from the States, where they actually want to be able to sell their whisky under the title of Scotch? Mr. Frost. Mr. Frost, can you hear me? Have you turned your microphone off? There's no light on it, Mr. Gove.
There seems to be a problem. I don't know whether those in the Boothroyd room can tell us what the difficulty is. I can see someone is trying to get the sound up and running again. Right, I think we're just going to have to hold for a moment, colleagues.
Mr. Gold, you may have turned the microphone on the
Can you hear us now?
Now, there we go, right.
Sorry about that.
Get going again. Now, Philippa, I think you were...
Yeah. Well, just obviously around the issue of protected geographical indicators, which are very important for many Scottish food and drink businesses, we're aware of some of the American asks. So is that not going to undermine trying to get protection for them within Europe and indeed in the rest of the world?
Well, obviously there's an interrelationship between where we go with the US trade agreement and where we go with the EU trade agreement. But I don't think anybody is suggesting, in fact I'm confident they're not, that we would change existing rules on existing UK geographical indications. And obviously I happen to know about the Scotch whisky one and the debate between Scotch producers and US whisky producers, and I don't think it's likely that we would wish to go to US standards on Scotch whisky.
Mr. Frost, you say quite often that you're asking just for a very standard free trade agreement, but on transport, security, data and financial services, is it not that actually the UK is asking for an unprecedented deal?
Well, just quickly, on transport, on air transport, no, we are asking for pretty standard stuff in aviation. On land transport, obviously, to some extent, it's unprecedented because there is no real precedent for a country next to the European Union.
You say geography. You say geography doesn't matter, but in that it does.
Well, but Canada doesn't have a land border with the EU that the lorry needs to go over. So obviously, in that sense, we have to tailor the text according to the
geography is important after all.
Okay.
It is if you need driver.
Thank you very much indeed. Next is Barry Shearman. Barry. We can't hear you, Barry. Somebody needs to unmute Barry's mic. There we are.
Is that better?
Off you go. Off you go.
I was saying that, Chair, that as a new boy on the committee, forgive me if I'm asking Michael Gove and Mr. Frost a naive question. They are skilled operators, but don't they see part of their job is communicating what they're doing to the great British public, my constituents and yours? Fact is that the press coverage and the media coverage is not very good on this. And is this not part of the team's mandate to communicate in this vastly important process, to communicate in language that people understand where we are, where we're going?
That's my responsibility, I suppose, as much as anyone else. Certainly it's a ministerial responsibility. And we do try to communicate the approach that we're taking in clear and simple language. I had the opportunity, for example, when asked about the negotiations on the TV, on BBC and Sky 10 days ago, to sort of sum it up. And I said, the EU want us to obey the rules of the club, even though we've left. And they want to have the same access to our fish as they've always had, even though they're restricting our access to their markets. Now, some people might think that's an oversimplification, but I was simply trying to sum up the UK government position with which reasonable folk, if they want to, can disagree.
Well, perhaps I'm, again, being naive. I check the week. It's something, a news digest every week that I check. I had to go past, time after time, week after week, to find any mention of what was going on in the negotiations. And they really cover a very broad range. And the fact of the matter is, I go round, many people think the typical town in Britain is Huddersfield, but it's atypical in the sense we're a big exporting town. And my business people and my people that export to Europe do not understand the rules and think so much jargon about the level playing field and non-tariff agreement is gobbledygook that they don't understand. Why can't you reach out better, telling them exactly what's going on?
As soon as I can, and it's safe to do so, I'll come to Huddersfield and talk to a group of local business people with you chairing the meeting there.
Thank you very much for that. But the last little bit of this is it took 8 years to get the trade deal with Canada. What hope is there as was really delivering this in the short time that we've got left?
My judgment is that it's perfectly possible to do so. That the letters that David and Michel Barnier wrote made clear that the principal difficulty is not a difficulty of technical detail. The technical detail on both sides is well understood. It's a difference of political position, and I hope that we can break that impasse.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Next is Nigel Mills. Nigel.
Thank you, Mr. Gove. Can I just return to the issue of goods moving between Northern Ireland and Great Britain? I think the government's proposal is to give those goods unfettered access. Can you just explain that unfettered means absolutely unfettered, no need for paperwork, no need for declarations or anything, or would there be some admin requirements on that?
That is correct.
So there's no requirement from the EU to know what goods have left the island of Ireland for their customs purposes?
Our interpretation in the command paper is that there is no requirement for that, and there hasn't been any pushback against that. There is a tiny set of exceptions, which is under the CITES Convention, which is the trade in endangered species, and under the Kimberley process, which is there to interdict the flow of blood diamonds. But it's a tiny, I think that's right, David, example. But for 99.9% recurring of trade from Northern Ireland to GB, no paperwork, no declarations should be required.
And that position wouldn't change if, heaven forbid, we had tariffs on EU-UK trade and there was some risk of revenue leakage for goods being routed through Northern Ireland into the mainland.
Our view is that it would be perfectly possible if you saw, for the sake of argument, a German firm attempting to use the Larne to Cairnryan route to get loads of high-quality BMWs onto the UK market. We think that we could spot that using market surveillance.
Okay, but that would be a fetter of some sort, I suppose, but probably a justified one. So on goods moving the other way, how are we going to manage the the problem of some goods being deemed to be at risk of moving into the Republic, and therefore the EU wanting declarations and tariffs. And I think you talk about there being sophisticated data and using latest technology. I mean, does that data exist? Does the technology exist? Would you put it in the public domain so we can see how it all works? Is this still a work in progress?
Yes, HMRC will have customs declarations. We can have access to that, and of course we'll make sure that the EU is fully cited on how we're operating that process. And it would mean that the overwhelming majority of trade from GB to NI stays in NI at the moment. But of course, if there was a good which went from Britain to Northern Ireland and then into the Republic, then a tariff would be payable when it went into the Republic. And of course, we're committed to using state aid flexibilities, paying or remitting the cost of that tariff for the company affected.
So that's slightly different to the at-risk process, which would mean that the tariff would have to be paid when the good crossed into Northern Ireland rather than if it subsequently moved to the Republic, though, isn't it?
It's the job of this specialised committee to decide which goods are termed at risk. Sorry, not specialised committee, the Withdrawal Agreement Joint Committee. And the command paper is the UK government's approach. We've outlined a way in which we think that we can protect the EU single market and also the UK's internal market in a way that has the least possible bureaucratic or other pressure on Northern Ireland's businesses and people. And we think that since the protocol exists to underpin the Belfast Agreement, that we hope that the EU will see that this is a constructive way forward. And again, I wouldn't want to preempt what the EU will say, but so far they've welcomed this step in the process. I'm sure that they will ask for further and better particulars, and there will be, in the Joint Committee, a further refinement of the EU's approach.
And finally, are you still, I think, more than 2/3 confident of a trade deal with the EU by the end of the year?
I am a fan of Aberdeen and Queen's Park Rangers, so I'm a natural optimist.
As a fan of Notts County, I feel even more of an optimist than you.
Right. Thank you very much indeed. Next is Matt Vickers. Matt.
Good afternoon. Mr. Gove, as the UK will not be seeking an extension to the transition period, how will we ensure business have sufficient time to adapt to the changing trading conditions?
Well, the whole of the country, indeed the whole of the developed world, is going through a significant economic shock as a result of COVID-19. Businesses everywhere are reviewing their supply chains and the approach that they're taking for the future. We're working with business, going back to the very first set of questions the Chair asked, in order to ensure that they are ready for those changes. And again, as the Chair acknowledged, some of those changes, being outside the Customs Union, the requirement for customs declarations, are well understood, but we stay closely in touch with business in order to make sure that we understand their level of readiness, and if we need to do more, we will.
Mr. Gove, how will we ensure that there is sufficient customs and logistics capacity on the border at day one?
Well, we're making sure that, for example, some of the processes that may be required to check products of animal origin when they come into the UK are being put in place by DEFRA, and work is going on there. More broadly, we've increased the number of people who work for Border Force in preparation for this change. And as we discussed earlier, £34 million has been made available to train people in the private sector to be able to navigate any new customs procedures.
Positive news. I think as well as the funding that's been made available, will there be enough time for industry to train and prepare for those new customs processes, given the impact of COVID-19 on their businesses?
We are working with business now to make sure that they have what they need in order to prepare. As the Chair pointed out earlier, there are a number of people in business who've expressed their concerns. We want to do everything possible in order to allay those concerns and make whatever changes are required to our preparations in order to help them be ready for that day.
Some areas, particularly transport and logistics, could change substantially as a result of COVID-19. How do you assess that risk that we negotiate something that's fit for the future, and how are you mitigating this?
Well, again, as David knows, we're arguing for a new economic relationship of a kind that we think is enduring, but also which works well for other countries. But you're right, as David pointed out earlier, there are specific issues that relate to the fact that we have, through the short straits, a large flow of our trade, particularly in perishable goods. And one of the things that we're discussing with the sector at the moment is how to make sure that for those vital supplies, which have been uninterrupted throughout the COVID-19 crisis, we continue to have that artery running clear.
Thank you very much.
Okay,
thank
you. And next is Dr. Jamie Wallace. Jamie.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This is a question for Mr. Gove. Going back and touching on the support for businesses, and as you have ruled out an extension to the transition period, are you considering an implementation phase? And if so, how might that work and how much will it cost?
No, we're not considering an implementation phase. But we do believe that whether you call it an implementation or transition period, that staying within the purview of the EU would mean additional costs for the UK taxpayer and being subject to additional EU laws. But one of the things that we will do is to make sure that businesses adjust appropriately to the situation on the 1st of January rather, when we're outside the customs union and the single market. So we'll be fully outside, fully sovereign, but we also want to make sure that we can support business with that adjustment.
Could you be a little more specific on what type of support you think businesses might need and what you imagine you might be doing come the end of the year to help with that transition?
I think, obviously, we've all been preoccupied with the COVID pandemic, and it is absolutely the case that it continues to be front of mind for everyone in government. It is also the case, though, that we can now step up our engagement with business in advance of December the 31st. Some of what is required is very well known, and we are making sure, as I mentioned, with the allocation of £34 million, that we can train people in the delivery of these new customs processes. And we're also in talks with the industry, as well as delivering online courses, on the establishment of a new physical customs academy in Kent.
Okay, and finally, you've mentioned the government support to businesses due to COVID-19, and also the support that you believe they may need to manage the change. To what extent will you manage the overlap between as we sort of come to the end of COVID-19 business support and we sort of move on to the leaving the EU business support?
Well, I sit on a ministerial implementation group led by the Chancellor and the Business Secretary that looks at support for business overall. One of the reasons I'm on it is to make sure that I can understand the approach that they're taking in feed-in from the point of view of business preparation for our departure from the EU. And again, one of the things that we are doing in conversation with business is making sure that we properly understand the way in which COVID-19 will have an impact on how businesses operate, where they source their supplies from, and what that impact would be on life outside the customs union and the single market.
Understood. And I think Mr. Chairman will be delighted that we're on time.
Well, Jamie, thank you very much for that. Now, we've got an absolute hard stop in 5 minutes' time, but I know there are a couple of colleagues who I did say if there were time, I could try and bring you back in. I wanted to ask first, Anthony Higginbottom, did you have one other question you wanted to put briefly?
Yeah, if I could, thank you, Chair. This was on financial services, which we've not touched on yet. I know we're proposing a very ambitious chapter in the free trade agreement. Just wondered how receptive the EU had been to that, because I noticed it wasn't in their draft legal text. And then a second related question on an equivalence decision. I mean, it should be purely procedural because our rules are 100% aligned. When do you think that decision might be taken?
So on the second point first, on equivalence, yes, that's our view. We're operating the same legislation at the point of exit, so obviously we are equivalent. The sooner the better is our wish. I get the impression that this final decision may not be that soon. but we are completely in the EU's hands on this, and obviously we're engaging very closely with them, but they do this to their own pace. On the free trade agreement itself, what we've been proposing is provisions rather like those in the EU-Japan agreement, which provide for, I suppose you might say, stabilised dialogue between regulators, some predictability in how you operate equivalence arrangements. The EU says that this infringes their autonomy, although they agreed it with Japan. So we still hope that they may see their way to agreeing it with us before this process is over.
Okay, thank you. And Rupa Huck, have you just time for one quick question?
Yes, so David Frost, I understand that you have a team of 40. I just wondered how many of those come with you to negotiations?
They all do. Apart from, I mean, obviously there has only been one round where we've moved physically, so it's a question of who's taking part in the negotiations. But basically they all do, apart from a small number needed in London to assure continuity.
Okay, thank you very much. Jane Stevenson, I think you had one other question, but you are okay now. Okay, no, that's fine. All right, well, thank you very much indeed. Well, that concludes our questioning. Can I, on behalf of all of the committee members, thank you, Mr. Frost, and you, Mr. Gove, for giving up your time today. It's been a very informative session, and we look forward to seeing you both again. I hope you won't mind, in keeping with our tradition, if we write to you with some follow-up points, and you have made one or two commitments to us as a result of the evidence you've given today. Is that okay?
Of course it is. We would be delighted, and thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to give evidence and for chairing so masterfully.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Order, order.